last meeting and then talk about some of the other testing that was proposed. Hopefully we can get through that today. We did extend the meeting by an hour, and then we'll move on to the other items that the council needs to make recommendations to the department regarding sample collection and storage, results reporting, remediation, retesting, and disposal. And then we've got a bullet for additional items as necessary, and I've collected some of those from council members who've sent them in. If we get there today, we can talk about them. If not, we'll do so next week, and then we'll do a meeting wrap-up. And just as a reminder, well, we'll talk about it with the council's charge. Okay, so the council is responsible for doing these things, which we go over at every meeting. So I think that y'all know it, but you can see it on the slide here. The last point is that we have a report to prepare that needs to be submitted to the governor and the legislature as of the end of this year. And so I've started the draft of that report to provide the background on the council and the recommendations that have been made to date. And so I'll be adding in the recommendations from today's meeting as well in the form of our approved motions. And I hope to get that out at the end of this week so you all can have a chance to review it before next week, which is our final meeting. Okay. And for those of you who are members of the public, you can follow along online if you don't have copies of the slides in front of you. We've got all our materials posted online as well, so the slides are posted online. If you look at last month's meeting, the most recent approved motions are all posted online as well, so you can see what the council has been up to prior to this point. Okay, so let's get started with our discussion and recommendations of testing and potency standards. And again, I'll note that these slides are all intended as a starting point for our discussion, and they're a compilation of a whole bunch of different things. They're information that Steve presented to us at the very initial meeting. They are information that have been provided by council members and others, items that we've discussed in this meeting, and other considerations that the department wants to make sure that the council is aware of as you're making your discussions and making recommendations. So we will start, as I mentioned, where we left off at the last council meeting, which was with heavy metals. Steve, do you just want to mention this chart real quick?
Sure. So, can everybody hear me? Okay. So, this was the chart that we had in our first meeting. This is my group put together a 50-state review of what all the other states were doing. We had put up a consideration that was basically coming off the Michigan standard to the council because it's coming off of the USP standard. There was discussion about Colorado standard that had come up, what it was, and I went and talked to the head of the Colorado program and confirmed that the standards that we have presented up there are Colorado's current regulations. The regulations that were the same as Maryland there were the ones that were presented were Colorado's older limits. So Maryland does have those standards that were also an option. They use those for all products. They don't split them out based on if they're inhalable or other than all. So again, we also had presented a consideration to the council to do chromium. That is something that other states do test for. They do find it, and they do find it in levels that are of safety concern. So it's something, since we are trying to build standards that are reasonable and safe, since we know that there are issues out there with that, it was something that we put out as a consideration for the council. There's a possibility where we could start this off in November or whenever metals are to be done, see if there's an issue with our products, and if not, then we have the ability to bring things in and out. So that's this chart, which was presented in the first meeting, we brought back.
And this is also posted online for anyone following along, so you can blow it up or play with it if you want. It's under the materials for the first meeting that we had. Thank you, Steve. So yeah, we had some discussion around this last time with a recommendation, and I'll flip to that so you can see. So Jay had mentioned at the last meeting the Colorado's current limits. And this is a listing of those in a different form, so you can see them in here under the Colorado table, but also here, this is directly from the Colorado rules that you have in here that shows the different metals as well as their levels and split out between the way that the product is used. And then here is what we talked about at the last meeting with a little bit of clarification. So we had a member recommendation for the table on the left. These were Colorado's prior limits, just to clarify, as Steve mentioned, they're Maryland's current limits, Colorado's prior limits. And then the table on the right is what ADHS had put out for consideration previously. I think that's the last metal slide that we've got in here as things to talk about, and I can flip back to whatever slide y'all want, or open it up for discussion on metals. Hi, Ryan.
Hi, Ryan Hurley, Arizona Dispensaries Association.
Nice, sounds sharp.
Thank you very much.
Put that in the record.
That wouldn't be the first time. I just want to clarify that it's the one particular form of chromium that we're concerned about. There are other forms of chromium that are treated naturally as a dietary supplement, for example. So I want to make sure if we do go forward that it's the hexavalent chromium that we're concerned about.
I think because of the type of digestion they do, the acid digestion and all, it would put it into total chromium. That's just, you would have to actually split out. We upstairs have the ability to split these out. If you have to put an LC on the front of your ICP mass spec and all to do some of the splitting out. I think they might be able to do hexavalent, but it's probably a different technology. It would have to be done with a different test. If you're doing the chromium that everybody else is doing out there in Michigan and everything, you can, we actually did a tour of all of the laboratories, or at least we're going to be going through all of them, but we actually went through the metals laboratories. And chromium is easy to add, but it's being done with an acid digestion that would put it into total chrome. So,
I mean, I suppose that would concern me if we're testing for something that might come up positive if it's not a safety concern, right? So I don't know. Maybe I could hear from one of the labs if it's
I'm not sure about that.
reasonable to test for just that one.
Cost-wise, it would add. Cost-wise, it sounds like it's going to add quite a bit more money to be able to separate it out. I don't know what detects people are getting of concern that, you know, we would need to split it out to see.
if it's done like the other states, then it's easy to add.
Right. It's part of the list of metals you'd run it all at one time, but not if you're separating it out.
So you don't have a problem with the other four, do you?
No, not at all. That
Maybe that's where we start, is to push the process on, we, try to get the four and then make a call on the other one.
that would be fine with me. I'd support a motion to adopt the Colorado limits on those, or the Michigan limits with the exception of chromium.
They're Maryland limits.
Maryland limits. There you go. Sorry.
Well, Maryland is over on the left. We have the Michigan are on the right where they split it out, which is what we were proposing.
I would say the labs can always screen for chromium
Yeah.
and report back in a year what we're finding, It's
Yeah.
pretty easy to do so and chart it. If that, we can recommend to just screen it. Not report it, but, keep a record of it. That'd be pretty easy.
So it comes down, the four metals on the right, the limits that are coming from Michigan are coming directly from the USP standard. So when we, as Arizona, do a standard or build a standard, DHS has got to put its hat, on something that we can explain to the public and all that this is going to be safe. Where did we get these numbers and all? Colorado's limits, which are actually Maryland's, those are coming from another standard. They are based in the Q3 elemental, so they're both coming out of different standards. We were proposing the one on the right, but because it was splitting them out, but again, it's
on your chart also, it looks like most of the states are doing 1.0 or give or take a little bit less on mercury, and then only 3 states, the USP standard, Michigan and Missouri, California have the 3.0. I don't know much about the toxicity levels or anything like that. Can anybody talk about the mercury? You know, why should we not go for 1.0 instead of 3.0? Looks like the other states, especially the newer ones, have their own levels set there, which is much lower. Can anybody talk to that? Not really educated on it. It seems like maybe a couple of them try to follow the USP standard, and maybe some of these newer ones, New York, Maryland, Oklahoma, they have a much lower standard that they set differently.
Some of those numbers, when we put them in white or they're in red, we don't know where they're coming from. We couldn't find where those numbers were coming from. And again, we were trying to build something for the council that actually is, we can say this is coming from USP or this is coming from this standard. So we weren't sure where those were coming from. We didn't have time to track down because it didn't seem like they were coming from a standard that was out there.
Can anybody maybe talk to toxicity levels? You know, and mercury in general can't be good. You know, if I'm smoking 3.0 mercury every day, 5 times a day.
Which is exactly why, if you look, the inhalable level is 0.1.
And then everything else is 3.0.
Right, because of that.
I mean, our skin absorbs it as well. So if I'm rubbing 3.0 on my skin 5 times a day, 10 times a day, you know, if it's topical, I might use it more often. I don't know. That stood out to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to make a motion to adopt the USP standards with the exception of chromium. We leave chromium off the list for the time being.
Second it.
Is that Maryland? That would be the Michigan, right?
Michigan.
Yeah, with the different for inhalable.
Michigan, California.
So can I flip, I'm sorry to flip on you. So are you talking this table on the right
Minus chromium.
minus chromium is what the motion is on the table?
That's correct.
My question though, for the lab's sake, Spencer, you probably know this more than we do because we just do testing in general, but how do we differentiate for you guys the difference between the inhalables and the others? Because a lot of the stuff we get in, we don't know if it's a concentrate to go in a medical, if it's how the product is used could be used several different ways. How would you differentiate into the system when we report out the results if it is inhalable and not?
When we send you samples, we tell you it's kitchen concentrate versus shatter or whatnot.
But if it's a kitchen those concentrates can still be put in dabs, correct? I don't know.
Correct.
Right? It still can be.
But we know what we're going to use it for. So I mean, we can tell you that that's the purpose.
Is that going to be sufficient? Because inhalable versus other, the limits are greater or less.
So the way we read the statute is what's going to be tested is the final product.
And that's an interesting point, Steve, and this is one I'm going to really harp on. For us, the final product is, say, an edible product. And I've already tested my flour, and I tested if I made concentrate from that. I tested that crude oil concentrate it came from. I tested both of those. Now, why on earth would I want to test for heavy metals and pesticides in a brownie when I've already tested twice already? That's my question. We actually went through the exercise of doing a costing, and I'm going to pass this out if that's okay. This just shows you, we went back and looked at how many SKUs that we actually do a month in terms of testing, and then we figured it out on a weekly basis. So there's a column here that shows 32.5 testing samples per week. If we did this and did the full panel, pesticides, potency, heavy metals, the micro, it would be on the order of about $17,000, almost $18,000. This is based on current cost for these things. Now, we spend about $6,000 or $7,000 a month on edible testing right now, and it may be about the same on flour. So you're going to tell me that this is going to cost me triple the amount if I have to test for these things further down the food chain, pardon the pun, in terms of these things that have already been tested for earlier, further upstream or further downstream. So I'm having trouble with that, and in practical matters, as I understand it, in the food industry, you have a whole variety of approaches you can take in terms of process validation, control studies, representative sampling, which is something that I guess we'll talk about, which is important, to try to make these costs reasonable. Because if this is the kind of cost we're looking at, and I'm talking to you, Jay, your prices for your patients are going to go up substantially.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know any dispensary that pays these full prices. I understand what you're doing. You're taking the retail here, but no dispensary is paying this.
Well, no, you're right. You can apply a 25% discount, which is...
there's bulk rates, there's different things like that.
This is the best we've gotten from folks like Tabitha.
In general, these prices are correct, though. Unless they're doing bulk rate, then they get the 10, 15, 25%
Well, they're
off.
submitting 26.5 a week.
You try to get more than 25% discount from Tabitha. She's going to tell you to take a hike.
I'll give you that.
So here's how I would respond to that. This is the current law in Arizona. And our job is to build a standard around the current law in Arizona. So we have asked, or we've had discussions, people about exemption authority and different things where we can separate these out and do things that make sense. But the way it reads right now, these are final products that are being tested. Other states do it in different places, and I assume that the final standard that gets implemented may be different than what is in current law. But right now, what we're trying to build is a standard that makes sense, to be reasonable to say. How that gets applied will be modified down the road here, I believe, because we can't do anything. You'll have to go to your legislator or lobbyist or whoever to make a law change here. But we need to get down what the standards are going to be, because right now everybody is sitting there waiting for this council to come up with these standards before they buy instruments.
Well, maybe to his
and
point.
So what we need to do is with this council, is to come up with the standards, make some modifications in the laws, so that we can proceed.
Modifications in the laws can take a long time if they've got to take place at the state house level.
Right.
We're not going to be able to change that other than making recommendations.
But this is the current law.
I mean, can we make the recommendation to articulate that it is the final product only? So when he's going through his extracting and his cultivating, it's not testing each one of those. It's when he's ready to put a tag on it and say this is for sale, that's the only product that he has to test.
The trouble is, I've made an enormous investment prior to that for me to make a batch of 1,000 brownies and go, whoops, we've got a problem now. I've got all the way back months perhaps.
That's why I say go for Colorado right now, given the flexibility and the large amount of testing and sensing, and then the large amount of different matrices that the product can be in. I would say go with Colorado limits, and then you don't have to define it as far. Or sorry, Maryland limits. I'm sorry, I misspoke.
Colorado does split it into another further, but we don't know where some of those standards are coming from.
Right. I would say in the spirit of facilitation and getting it done, and not research based, more of an executable base, I would say that would be the more forgiving limit, given that we don't have an agreed upon tech, and that's kind of where I was going to go with it. If given the kind of the work I said I would do last time with the heavy metals, the elements of concern are really arsenic, cadmium, lead, and mercury, obviously, and really in that order. From what my conversations with the soil testing labs, chromium isn't really something that they encounter very often, and they didn't feel that it was necessary to include at this time. And given that there is a couple different methodologies of testing, OES and mass spec, it seemed to be that the the more forgiving limits would be the recommendation given this current time, and then to be further defined later as technology or something advances. But that was my recommendation. I would make the motion to adopt the Maryland limits.
So we currently have a motion on the table to adopt the right side of this slide set minus the chromium, and a second on that motion. Would folks like further discussion on that motion before a vote, or it sounds like maybe there's talk of a different motion?
Are we all okay with the 3.0 mercury? Or maybe we could agree to do something in the average of the rest of them, 1.5. Like I said, none of us know anything about it to say, but it's the highest of the threshold.
I'd make a motion for the Maryland limits.
So, hold on,
You got two motions.
So we have two competing motions right now, so either, Ryan, we can take your motion to a vote, you can withdraw your motion, we can continue discussion.
Yeah, let me do a little bit more discussion, then I'll consider withdrawing it.
Okay.
Tabitha, could you tell me what, I know arsenic is relatively present in a lot of water sources. Do you see that as a common thing that comes up potentially higher than the 0.4?
No, they're all very, very minimal.
Okay.
With that, yeah.
So it's not something you see very often?
No, not at all.
Okay. I'd be willing to withdraw my motion then.
Okay. So Ryan's motion is withdrawn. We can have additional discussion, or if someone else would like to make a different motion.
Make a motion to adopt the Maryland limits. Mine, yeah.
I would make a motion for the Maryland limits, but 1.5 on the mercury for other.
So to clarify the current motion on the table, that would be the table on the left-hand side of the slide, the Maryland limits, as it's stated currently on here. So arsenic at less than or equal to 0.4, cadmium less than or equal to 0.4, lead less than or equal to 1.0, and mercury less than or equal to 0.2.
Right.
And that would be in all product types.
He's talking about the left one?
Yes.
What was the old one?
Yeah. Yeah. So we have a motion and a second.
That's for everything, inhalables down the line.
To be further
I
bifurcated
think
down the
it'd be
line.
easier
Just
and
in the
then-
spirit of facilitation, getting this done. I
Yeah.
mean, so we don't have to break out all the finalist products, so we don't have to, I mean, there's so much definition work.
I don't want to do it with
You know how long
inhalable,
that's
it's
gonna
not
take.
either.
I would say that would be just in the spirit of facilitation, just to get this moving.
I'll third that one.
There you go.
I have been texting with David Luttrell, who owns Lone Pine Analytical, who does ICP-MS testing. He indicates the mercury limits are too low in the Maryland current limits, and suggests 1.2 parts per million instead of 0.2.
So just 1.2.
Just increase it.
To just increase.
You're okay with that being in the middle with the USP ones is fine too?
It's,
You want me
Falls in
to
between
flip
the
here so you can see the others as well?
And then maybe he suggests monitoring chromium levels for 6 months or so, as Steve suggested, and seeing if it's something that needs to be added at that time.
You want to amend your motion?
I guess I could amend the motion to increase the mercury limit to 1.2 for that recommendation.
So, okay, so there's a motion and a second.
Right.
That would be, and it's an amended motion at this point, to adopt the table on the left-hand side of this slide with the adjustment that mercury would be less than or equal to 1.2 parts per million
Correct.
as the limit. Everything else being the same, less than or equal to 0.4, 0.4, and 1.0.
That's in line with the Nevada medical program, which has other limits as well. Arsenic is 2.0 parts per million, cadmium 0.8, ppm, lead, I think it was lead PB.
Yes.
Lead is at 0.4, and mercury at 1.2, as we discussed. So I don't know if we have a basis for adopting Maryland versus Nevada, or if we're just adopting.
Amended Maryland, so Maryland with mercury 1, 2.
Again, Maryland is coming off of a standard
Right.
2-3 element or impurity. There's an actual paper that goes through body weights and dosage and everything else. We have to be able to put our hat on something here, some kind of standard on these things.
So there's a motion and a second on the table. Does anyone need me to repeat the motion? Okay. All right. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay. Motion passes. Thank you. The next slide related to metals is regarding method considerations. Comments on
Same,
this?
right? As it
Yes.
was, yeah.
Yeah, nothing's changed on this one. And we tried to broaden it to make sure it captured the language we'd incorporated for previous methods.
I'll move to adopt that as written.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, thank you. Great, congratulations. It's not even 9:30 yet. You made it through heavy metals. Nice job. Okay, so we're going to move on now to the pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, and growth regulators, which is quite the mouthful. And we'll discuss a little bit of background. We've got Jennifer here to talk to us a little bit, and then I'm expecting some discussion around these since it's quite a substantial list. Steve, do you just want to remind us what you've discussed with Oregon?
So, in the first meeting, we put up a consideration to the council on the Oregon standard. And we told the council that they put together their standard with a full group of different labs, epidemiologists, toxicologists, dispensaries, many different groups to come up with something that would be a safe and reasonable standard is the way they proposed it. And the next slide
Okay.
actually goes through how they did it for pesticides. They put weights on based on the toxicology of the pesticide, the availability of the pesticide, the analytical capacity of the pesticide. What they were looking at was they were able to build a standard that only requires one instrument. And it's expensive. All of these instruments are expensive. So if you were to do California's instrument or list at their level, you would need two instruments, both the LC triple quad and the GC mass spec. So what Oregon was able to do with their list was to be able to bring it to just one instrument, one run, instead of having to have two different runs. So an LC triple quad is, depending if you get it on sale, can be anywhere from $350,000 to $400,000. And the GC mass spec, which California requires, can be anywhere from $200,000 to $300,000. So it's a cost, but they were able to get it to one. Now, I don't know. I have a chart up here and everything, but we don't have to go through that right now because it'll be after the discussion. Some of the states were not totally happy with how they came to their safety limits. They like the list, but they don't necessarily like the limits. And we'll get into a discussion about limit of detection and limit of quantitation and all. But what Oregon did was they were looking at the ability of all of the laboratories, because the limit of detection and quantitation change based on the labs. They're going to be different with the labs, and then it changes also when you are in production mode. So they built a limit where they took the limit of quantitation and doubled that, which brought them into a level that can be done safely with this list. So I just wanted to, we're going to have a little bit of discussion about LODs and LOQs, but that's how they came up with their list, was through a lot of thought and a group to put it together. There are, as we'll talk about, people are starting to put together, instrument companies are putting together methods around the Oregon list. It is a thing out there that everybody talks about and recommends. When you look to buy standards, the Oregon standards, as I will show, are available. So it's something that the people in the nation are starting to build around in different places. So that's what we should have for you.
Thank you. And then Jenny, what do you want to do?
Oh, either.
Okay. Do you want to come up and address the council, please? Yes, that's fine. No problem. And if Brian or George, if you can pass her a microphone, that would be great.
Yeah.
So Jennifer will be discussing the document you have in front of you. It's also posted online, titled Arizona Proposed Pesticides.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, cool. I'm Jennifer Corso, for those of you that I haven't met prior. I am the lead scientist for Darwin Brands and Banyan Scientific LLC. I'm a research and development scientist. My background is biochemistry and exercise metabolism in professional research settings. So that's how I kind of got involved in doing this through an analytical perspective. So I went ahead over the last 2 months and kind of put together a Arizona Smart List, if you will, based on a compilation of looking at what all the states have tested for all together, which is available on the DHS website. So you can compare and contrast what the states across the board are testing for, and then dug into a bunch of clinical research as well in support of kind of recommending, based on a variety of individuals' inputs. So I spoke with analytical personnel, laboratory personnel, a horticulturist, and a couple others, just to get multiple perspectives put into this as well. And again, it's just data and recommendations, so obviously up for discussion. Obviously, I'm not voting on this either. So I hope you guys took the time to look through this and have good questions, just because I am just one person again. So some of the things taken into consideration too are the cost. So obviously this is going to be costly for the labs, especially if they don't have the instrumentation like Steve said, and then for the businesses. So if we were to test for everything recommended by Farmer, you're looking over 280 agents, and that's not really feasible for us to test at the current state of our industry, especially when we're relying on just about a dozen analytical labs, third-party labs in the states to be handling all of this and all the commodities that they're going to be considering coming into the lab. The quantity doesn't necessarily interfere with the time it takes to test for these things, test for all the agents as far as the labs are concerned, as long as we regulate it to specific instrumentation and keep the costs down so they can test it one and done, perhaps a column swap for like one or two different agents, which I'll explain in here too, and of course that's up for discussion as well. Some other things as far as background goes. So right now, if we were to take the federal regulations into account, there'd be zero tolerance for anything that is used on cannabis because it's not an IR4 project approved commodity. So basically the IR4 project is a federally funded research project that essentially instates all the regulations and registrations on minor crops. And so right now for hemp, that's what the hemp program is going through the USDA, and it is regulated through the USDA and typically takes about 2 years to get approval for whatever that crop is. Another thing you can look at also and do some research on, I don't think we're going to have time to vote on all of this today because there's a lot of things to discuss, is FIFRA, which governs all the sale and the use of pesticides, the training, the regulations, registrations, any revisions, cancellations. So dig into FIFRA, F-I-F-R-A, which is a federal insecticide, fungicide, and rodenticide act. and you can see how the that's governed by the EPA, not the USDA. You can dig into how they go about deciding all the regulations and the registrations on anything that's used on different commodities, not just food, in which you can look in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 40, and look at the toxicological data there for food commodities. So there's a lot of things that need to be taken into consideration, as well as our industry, obviously. So I did go through also and pull up the pesticide use on cannabis paper that was published in 2015 by two gentlemen in Oregon. So these two gentlemen went through and they pretty much did the dirty work to come up with the Oregon list in conjunction with the information that Steve just presented to everybody here. And they looked at the statute that stated originally that pesticides in Oregon, quote, must be tested for the following analytes. And this is just to give you background. Chlorinated hydrocarbons, all organophosphates, carbamates, and pyrethroids, which constitutes 491 agents. And of course they were like, well, that's too many. One that would put everybody out of business, and we don't have the infrastructure in the industry set up to do that. So they did their own analyses and looked at 389 samples of flour, 54 samples of concentrates, and tested them for 65 analytes. And they found, and I can send this to everybody, Jessica, I can send this to you to put this up if anybody hasn't seen this yet. And they looked at what ended up showing up on all of these samples, and they found that 24 agents repeatedly showed up over and over again, and the concentrate levels were astronomical. For example, they tested some RSO for myclobutanil, and they had it show up at 110,000 parts per billion. So then they delineated further and came up with the list as Steve went into earlier. So I kind of took that into consideration when putting this together too, as well as the other states and all 76 compounds that were on all of the states all together, and came up with what you have before you. So we looked at 73. There was one that was redundant, which was methylparathion, and it was listed here also as parathion methyl. It's the same exact compound. It's just listed twice. I did add 2 new agents on here, so this list did include 2 new agents that aren't on the original all states DHS list, just because they're new versions of other spiral compounds that are now being used more frequently, and came up with a proposed list to test of 61. Total to be determined of 6, total no of 5 based on all 73, and then total banned, something that we should not allow any tolerance on, of 7. And obviously we could add more to those based on, you know, carbamates, any neonicotinoids that we don't want to be used on any of our crops, or organophosphates also, just because, or organochlorines, because they're just hazardous. So that was presented here. I did also propose 2 testing limits, one for inhalable and one for ingestible or other concentrates, and obviously that's up for discussion. There are 2 other states that currently do that. I thought it was a good idea because you do bypass first pass metabolism through an inhaled route, and transdermal if you want to take that into account, and suppositories if you want to take those into account too. We could come up with our own way to determine whether or not we want a certain residual limit for those products that do bypass first pass metabolism through any other route of ingestion, such as edibles and ingestible products, and then having a second route because the metabolism of the agent is going to be different. So that has been listed on here. Another thing that was looked at were the toxicity classes. So the EPA's toxicity class, and there are charts listed on the bottom of this. You can see what they mean. The EPA's toxicity classification scheme listed with the LD50s for oral, dermal, and then an LC50, which is the lethal concentration at which 50% of whatever the subjects were, animal subjects were, was fatal. And then that can be used to determine some inhaled limitations. The GHS classification scheme, and then obviously the WHO classification scheme as well. Part of the research review included kind of looking at not just the PPMs, but several databases for clinical information. So I looked at the Oregon research, 40 CFR Part 180, which is all the residual limitations on food commodities here in the United States. And that is regulated by the EPA. And the crops that I looked at to kind of make a comparative to cannabis were hops heavily, just because they're similar in nature and obviously related. Any edible oil crops, so safflower, sunflower, and if it was listed as the edible oil, olive oil in particular, citrus oil, things like that, that would have a similar dissolution capability for some of the pesticides, as would things like concentrates, because it is an oil. Let's see, what else did I look at? Coffee, and there was a few that listed chocolate. I just thought that was kind of interesting to note, just because we do put cannabis in all kinds of different edibles. And we were hoping that the food product that was tested prior, so if we're producing, say, a brownie from chocolate, obviously the chocolate had to meet its own ppm level. However, we're also bringing in another product or food commodity into those already tested products, so that does need to be thought about, and I feel should be discussed too. Cornell Pesticides Management Education Program and XToxNet is basically a research database at Cornell that looks at all of the hazardous clinical information, hazardous substances data bank from ToxNet. That's an NIH-regulated data bank, the HSDB, that will list the studies and the results, the metabolomics of each of the hazardous materials, including all the pesticides. PEMP, which is pesticide profiles aside from the EPA and the Federal Registrar, so that's more another database. The Codex Alimentarius, which is the codex that the WHO and the UN uses to establish thresholds on food commodities. It does not always line up with what the EPA determines. I found sometimes it was higher and other times it was a lower threshold limit, and so if there was something I noted that was kind of interesting, I did put that in the notes here in a different color. You can see the comparative ppm limit. The National Pesticide Information Center, or NPRO, is a collaborative between Oregon State and then the EPA, so that is another database that has information on all of the products that have been registered with the EPA that are pesticides. They include canceled products, so say some of the organophosphates that have been canceled and are no longer allowed to be used on food commodities. You can still find information on those there because people still do get a hold of those, and we have seen those. Various labs have seen those being used on some of the cannabis products that come through the labs, even though they're technically banned and canceled products or agents. Pesticides property database is a University of Hertfordshire database that has a lot of the clinical information and chemistry information. PubMed, PubChem. Hops regulations were taken into account, so U.S. Hops Industry Plant Protection Committee can be regulated by each state, so some states ban some pesticides and other agents that other states may not, based on that commodity, and it's very similar in parallel to what the cannabis industry is doing in each of the different states. Obviously, we have different limitations in different states, and some states test for things that others don't, and hops does the same. And the Hops Growers of America do that as well. I also took into account some of Arizona's common crops. So cotton and alfalfa are two major crops that are grown here that have their own pesticide regulations that are listed in 40 CFR Part 180 also. So if they're used heavily in Arizona and perhaps not other states, they could be of a heavier they could have a heavier risk of use here in Arizona just because they're more available than they would be in states like Maine or the Pacific Northwest, where you may not see those because they don't have the crops they're used on. And then tobacco regulations, which I did throw in here. They haven't been updated since 1989. I had like 4 people dig around for updated regulations on this as well, and there just aren't any. And in fact, on the list, there's one chlordane that was banned by the EPA for use on tobacco in 1988, even though it's still on the list, so the list hasn't been updated since then. And then there are two that are commonly used, like metalaxyl that we've seen on cannabis that are also used on tobacco that aren't on the list for being tested. So I thought that was interesting as well, because you can take into the residual limits of tobacco into account for the inhaled residual limits for cannabis. However, a lot of those are not being used on cannabis or are already banned. So I thought I'd get more out of that part than I did, but the information was just really difficult to find or non-existent on that. So that taken into account, as far as the PPMs listed here go, so you can take into account the AOAC's PPM limits, the USP's PPM limits, the other states' PPM limits, and the research that was done with that. The research that was done and the data presented for other similar crops, like I stated earlier, and came up with just some reference limits here for discussion. Based on those data put together. The other perspective that needs to be taken into account when determining the PPM limits that we should decide upon are the metabolics of it. Is it a bioaccumulator? And you can't really compare a patient that uses cannabis once a week to a patient that uses cannabis and a gram of RSO every day, for 3 months straight if they're using it for cancer or something. That's just incomparable. And for some of these agents that do, say, bioaccumulate or have a higher acute toxicity level, it's difficult to compare and contrast, and that, I think, should have a large discussion also. Instrumentation review. So everything on the list that's been proposed can be tested on an LCMS. Methylparathion is the only one that needs a column swap. So that's about as difficult as it gets as far as time goes. If you're testing 5 agents versus 15 agents and it's the same instrumentation, the number of agents doesn't really matter as much as what it is you're testing. So tried to keep that narrow. Obviously, that's important to take into consideration. And as well as the frequency it's being seen in the lab. Obviously, we're going to have to implement some type of list, and the frequency is going to change, or frequency is going to be delineated over the time at which we are starting to test these things, and I think a review would need to be done heavily for this list a year from now. If not, we can propose, I don't know if we can propose something sooner, maybe 6 months even after we see, hey, we're not seeing anybody using Coumaphos in the state of Arizona, so we're going to remove it from the list because, one, it saves everybody money, and two, it would be a waste of time at that point. So I did propose a phase rollout list as well. So we could, and this is obviously up for discussion, roll out phase 1, which I had 58 agents on here, 58 of the 73 of all agents. And it included all the to-be-determined agents. So I did include those on these lists. And then phase 2 would be all of them to include the to-be-determined. And I did split them a year apart. We can take things off of phase 1 or add them to phase 2 or not even do anything like this if we determine it's not a good idea. But I think it would be a good way to figure out what actually needs to be tested for as far as frequency goes. Yeah, I think that's kind of it as far as a down and dirty of what I did. Route of administration does need to be taken into account, hence the other versus inhaled, frequency of use again, and then revamping the limits, I think, are 3 points of discussion that we should focus on. Does anybody have any questions?
I think what Betty did was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you for that review. It's highly technical, what you just said. I can try to summarize it maybe. Sure. So the next slide, a little bit of what she has proposed and what other states and everything. I'm not an artist, but I tried to make something simple because with the scientists, when we get together, organic chemists are always talking about LOD and LOQ and the different states that don't like Oregon, because Oregon actually took the LOQ and doubled it and said that it's still reasonable and say, but California and some of the others want to be in these lower levels. So the lower you get on doing the detection, the more inaccuracy you start to get into. So that's where Oregon, in their discussions and everything, put together their limits. So on to the next one. So what I wanted to also show you is that essentially what Jenny is proposing, and I don't know if I should get up with my chart here and everything, because it was in the first meeting that we, okay, fine. So this was up in the first meeting that I didn't see a lot of people come up and look at it and all.
It's also posted online for anyone who would like to reference it.
It's hard to see. So what you're seeing in green here is that's Oregon list. And here's the AOAC limits and the USP limits and what the different states are doing. And you can kind of see a block that's coming around with the Oregon limit and all. So what we did was we took a look at what Jenny was saying about which one she was recommending on there. And she's essentially recommending a Oregon list with a few minor exceptions and limits and everything. So in here are the dots are what Jenny was bringing up. So she, to be determined for chlorantraniliprole, there you go, something like that. And not testing for the aminoside. That's a growth regulator. So, and then to be determined for paclobutrazol, which is another growth inhibitor. You got to give me one growth inhibitor here, or you're going to have to knock it out.
I changed that, actually.
Okay.
I had sent a updated list to Jessica, I think on the 2nd, and I included paclobutrazol on that, excuse me.
And that's
yes.
fine, as long,
Yeah.
So what?
So you can include it on there, because I did include that.
And then there's a couple. There were 3 that were additional to the Arizona or the Oregon list. And what I wanted to show with this is the way organic chemists put together their analyses is if you're going to do an Oregon list, you have 6 different mixes you got to put together, and you got to buy all those. So here are the 6 mixes. And so in each one of those different mixes, you have a number of the different compounds. So if you go to the next one, I think it is where it's coming off. Those 3 are the ones that Jenny was saying either not do or to be determined. But what I want to present is that you're still going to be putting that into your mix. You're still going to be analyzing for that. You're still going to calibrate for those because you're still going to want to know what that is. So if you throw something off of the Oregon list, the lab is still doing all the work of the analysis of it because you need to be able to separate it and know if something shows up there that it's going to be there. So taking something off of an Oregon list doesn't necessarily save any time for the lab, other than maybe in reporting.
Processing data does.
Right, reporting. But if you're using ChemStation or something, it's going to automatically put out a report and what the number is. So even the computer system, as long as it's set up, is going to automatically be putting out the numbers.
That's if someone has a LIMS system, which I think is a requirement now, right?
Well, no, the ChemStation is going to put out a list.
The report, okay.
So getting it to the LIMS station, which is the reporting part, that's where it might be different. So, but you're still going to be doing this for the analyses to have all of these in because it's coming anyhow in the mix.
Can I just clarify? Sorry, and Jenny, I didn't compare the 2 lists. I think the one we have in front of us, though, has all 3 of them on there now, or maybe it's missing the one that starts with a D.
Okay. I sent...
The diminazide is the only one that's not on your list now. I think the other 2 are, though.
Okay. And again, that can all be done with the LC triple quad. The 3 that are being added, the one that we had an issue with a little bit is the Chlordane.
Okay.
Just because the others, I believe, can be done with electrospraying. If you're going to do the chlorine, you can do it by the LC triple quad, but you'd have to change out the mechanisms to get that to work. So it's not something that, if the council wants to add it, that's fine. These other, I guess this is a new one that Jenny has identified. But I think our recommendation at this point with the consideration is a lot of this has been reviewed by Oregon, and they came up with a limit. We would recommend that right now with our time limits, we adopt something that others have said is reasonable and safe, and then we can modify and look at inhalable and all the different things in the coming year or so.
Is the one that needs a column swap, is that part of the Oregon list?
Methylparathine, yeah.
That's gonna be difficult too, because it's double running.
That's what I was going to say, Steve. The exception would be, we're going to see them all based on the standard unless we have to flip a column. That's going to double runtime.
And
So
I know
that's-
most of us aren't gonna have more than one triple
Right.
quad per lab right now, at least.
So that is something that is brand new to us, the column swap. So if that's true, then that would be an issue. Doesn't mean that it isn't a issue with the marijuana or that, out there being used, but would double the analysis. So this is the first time we've heard about it because we've been analyzing the different methods that are out there in companies and everything. I've never heard that it requires a column swap.
I'm sorry, can someone say it again, which one?
It's methylparathion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's gonna take
Yeah.
a
The
lot more.
beauty of having the mass spec is that it's self-confirming. You didn't have to have multiple columns or different things. So we have a couple of the labs. There's at least, I see 2 Oregon people in the audience, but that have done this analysis with Oregon stuff, but we can't bring them forward. But
Can we?
I don't know. Because I've
We can
never
at a future
heard
meeting,
that
yeah.
point. Yeah, I think it has to be proposed up front or presented, but our recommendation though, and maybe you can put that as a caveat on that one compound, would be for a good, reasonable and safe start, something that where all the instrument companies and things are available, start with Oregon levels, and then we can, once everybody gets their instruments and we get everybody on the same page and with doing the same thing, we can take a look at levels if we want to change levels and do everything. But right now, I don't think we have time to be looking at too many changes to what is out there. That's what we would bring forward.
Jennifer, first of all, thank you for this. This is an enormous amount of work, clearly, so we really appreciate it. I noticed that there are a lot of differences here between what you're proposing for limits or for levels of action versus Oregon. And a lot of places are almost in half or less. That concerns me a little bit. We do know that Oregon is at least functioning.
Sure.
And so I would tend to err on that side. I'm a little also would prefer if our fellow panel members Hope Jones and Steve Cottrell were here to weigh in on this with their expertise. So I'm a little hesitant to act without them, but we do know that that Oregon is working, and maybe with the exception of that one compound.
They're not separating out the inhalable versus the other,
No.
right?
No, they're
It's
not.
just
Okay.
one standard.
I just saw that she had it separated out. Thank you for the list.
And I think
Good job.
that could be possible down the line, once
It's
all the
really hard
labs
to
are set
decipher
up.
it,
where
yeah.
But we would have to look at the specific products, look at the limit of detection, and really get into it with the, and we could have that kind of study once we
Is that
have
in the
all the
charging
instruments
Sure.
together.
To reevaluate, is that part of this? Reevaluation? Is that?
Well, down the line, after we see what type of detects we're getting
Of course.
and the type of products we're rolling in, I think we can address it a year down the line. Like if we want to make the parts per million different between the matrices.
Is that part of what we can do? I would say then yes.
Yeah, because, I mean, we determine if we're going to go by a certain limit or separate out between inhalable or the other.
If the revisit is possible, I would err that way.
So
What
to-
Ryan's suggesting.
To clarify that point, the council's deliverable is to make these initial recommendations and the report, but you could include a recommendation in the report that the council reconvenes if that's something that you guys were interested in doing. I don't know if this battery's out, Corey.
That's how you send it.
Don't most states do these pesticide tests just for flour and trim, not edibles? And so it starts with the base product, and then everything else doesn't have that testing?
At this point, again, we're looking at the way the statute is worded.
I'm gonna name a product after you. I'm gonna charge a fortune for it. Absolutely will be.
So I would recommend that once we get the authority and the different things that we can do to make this reasonable, so that we can split it up and everything to what we need. What we really need to do is get these standards so that the labs have direction of what they need to buy.
But you're saying still test this on every single product?
That's the way it is currently
Finished product, yeah.
worded.
I mean, we could ultimately make a recommendation that would suggest that they really consider alternatives, but like you say, that's gonna have to be something that comes from the legislature.
I think a couple of little tweaks on the statute would be very clarifying.
In the meantime, I think the only way we can keep our costs down, I mean, you're gonna have to pay attention to what the labs have to do equipment-wise and the testing protocols and how much time it takes, but it's gonna be the representative sampling. That's the only way we're gonna be able to manage these costs.
Yep.
Column swap is going to be double running, double test for us on our level. It's not all reporting in one run.
Can you say that again, Tabitha?
With a column swap for that one compound, that's double running, so it's going to increase the cost quite a bit with our run times and, our analysis and processing the data, and just the column swap itself and getting the instrument ready to run again, or a different column. It all takes time and money, people to do it.
If I get Jay's discount, I'll be able
But methylparathione
I don't
isn't
like to
on the
swap a
Oregon list.
column any day. Like, it just takes you down for a minute.
Methylparathione is the one that requires the column swap, and that's not currently on the list, right?
It is.
And that it is currently. Oh, it is. Okay, understood. Okay.
If I could, I just want to thank Jenny. I know that she's done a couple months of deep dive work on this, and it is greatly appreciated. I think the industry owes her a debt of gratitude.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Thank you, Jenny. And also, I think that we have a duty to balance centrist science with, patient protection and avoiding the artificial choke points. I know I keep harping on this, that have stopped other states' programs dead in the water, and we can't allow that to happen. And there are other people involved. We've gotten more input just this morning, at 10 minutes before this meeting, and I think there's additional conversation that needs to happen here. But this is a great jumping-in point, and I think that by the meeting next week we'll have more information, and that's what's going to have to be looked at as well.
Are you suggesting we table the vote on the pesticides until the next meeting?
Yes.
Before you make a motion, sorry, I don't want to interrupt a motion-making process. We had, I think, one additional slide on pesticides. I just want to make sure that the council looks at, which is going back to Tabitha's point she made at the last meeting regarding compounds that were potentially difficult to test. And so I wanted to make sure that the group saw some of these in the notes on these as well. And then please proceed with your motion. But I didn't want to.
They were all, I love how you copy and paste my hurried email. Yeah, they're all doable. We run for them all right now. They're just That first one's the worst one. It pretty much degrades in a curve, but, I mean, they're all doable. I was just giving some more input on those compounds in general.
Thank you.
We did more research on these too and found that there are a couple that even other people were having issues with. So when we start to develop the standard with the method criteria and everything, we will have those noted, and we might have to put special kind of method criteria around them and everything, but we're aware of that.
Okay, yeah, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
You get these problem children in chromatography.
It doesn't mean you don't test for them, it just means that they're special, and we'll have to take care of them.
That would be better if they had a little bit broader QC limits and stuff.
And we
to
could always
help
do
accommodate
that.
the labs to get data out, so we have good bracketing QC each time.
When we're building the April regs, we're hoping that we'll have enough labs in place that we can ping these off and buy as we're building the method criteria from the EPA methods that we're talking about here to make sure that everything we're doing is going to work. So we want it to be reasonable.
And George, if I may ask, what further information or what other suggestions do you think that would be brought to the table? I mean, what would be served by tabling it today?
There's been some discussion about taking a look at it with daily allowable exposures taken into account, and a review that way, you know, just.
And is that something that you would do? I just want to make sure that we're utilizing our time.
You know, Jenny can flesh that out.
Okay.
So looking at like NOAEL 80 allowable daily exposure limits is important, and that's what you would do to determine like tox classes and things like that. Bioaccumulation needs to be taken into account based on the metabolism of each compound. However, the EPA did that with these agents and had already established PPMs based on that information already in anything that has a registered use within the CFR 40. So it's already been done. The research has been done, and you can look up, you know, they did a rat study on abamectin in 1992, and they found that the LOEL is XYZ, and then we determined that, you know, it bioaccumulates after, 3 weeks of exposure or something like that. So that information is taken into account when the EPA and the subsidiary groups and panels are trying to establish the end state PPM limits. And then the PPM limits are established based on what's actually left on the crop. So they do the research as far as what happens physiologically in the animal studies, and if there's any human exposure studies that are done. And then they apply the pesticides or the agents as they're supposed to be applied to determine what's left on the crop, and then, apply that to what the research has been done to determine, everything else, and then whatever the safety limits are and the residual limits. So yeah, that needs to be taken into account, but it already kind of has been, if that makes sense, in what's been published and then accepted. It just hasn't been done in cannabis because we're not legal.
It has been in Oregon because
Yeah.
Oregon looked at EPA and all those kind of things and had toxicologists and everybody in the room when they came up with those limits and looking at those levels. So again, I think this has been done in Oregon with cannabis, and
I think the only difference would be some of the states that look at the inhaled and not just everything together, because you do have a difference in concentration that reaches the blood versus something that's being ingested or otherwise put into your body through a different route, because then you do have some things are dermally toxic and some things aren't. So if you're going to, look at something that's a transdermal or a topical and apply one set of limits to that, and then if you're going to look at the same type of agent and inhale that and use the same limits, that needs to be taken into consideration, hence why I propose 2 different lists as far as residual limits go. But again, a lot of that information is already available based on studies that have been done. And some of it isn't. So you have newer pesticides that don't have as deep of a research database that goes along with them. And other ones that have been thus canceled also that are still common, like methylparathion is actually an organophosphate, and it's fairly highly toxic. And yeah, you have to do a column swap, but do we care about the patient or the column swap? So that's something that we need to think about with something like that too. So, the EPA stopped allowing use of that in like 1980 on target. I'm taxing my memory here. Established a lifetime health advisory for that particular agent to 60 micrograms per liter. And then you can't apply it indoors. So if, somebody's applying that outdoors, there's still a limit. So if you have an outdoor grow, for example, and you're using methylparathion, it's even at risk to your workers. So throw that on down the line to see, apply residual limits to somebody that's inhaling something like that. You'd probably want to have a separate residual limit for that, for inhaled products versus something that's ingested. Just some food for thought.
The Oregon list is, I think, without question, the gold standard in pesticide testing. SciEx, equipment manufacturer, for example, patterns or bases their entire LCMS program after the Oregon list. I don't think that's a point that can be argued. My fear is, and that's why I like Jenny's suggestion that we phase it in. I mean, Colorado was, and agreed their list is not perfect, but they were phasing in pesticides last year, I believe, and they've had testing for a number of years. So my point is a balance of patient protection and not creating the artificial choke point that stops the industry. And there's common ground there.
I think there's only now one compound that Jenny, in the Oregon list, that Jenny isn't including. So, and that's the
diaminazide.
Right.
But
So,
that's in the standard, right, that we purchase anyway?
right. And
Right.
it's coming anyhow, so you're going to put it in there. If you don't want to report it, that's fine. But it's going to be there. You're going to do the work.
The cost isn't going to be any more.
So, and the reason we showed that is, Oregon is the gold standard. I would bet that there's states that are going to fight it, like California, that want to have lower limits. But when I talked with the Agilent people, they said that you can't even see those limits. We're just making believe at those limits. So, and you need 2 different instruments. So I think the Oregon list is, again, responsible and safe, and a good place to start.
Does Oregon apply that list to all their products?
Yes.
Edibles, concentrates, they all
Right.
get tested one after the other.
And so once we get, and you can break this down, the methylparathion, that is definitely an issue if that's true. That's the first time we've heard about it. So I think if the council were to adopt the Oregon list with a review of methylparathion, whether we can go out and actually do more research on that and bring it forward next meeting on that compound.
Yeah, George, I guess I was looking for something that would change my mind from being inclined to support what Oregon's already done and what's working there, and I don't know that I've heard anything that would change my mind on that. So seems like maybe we have what we need to take some action today. I'd like to hear from my fellow panel members.
I've always used the Oregon list. I found it not too bad. I was just asking our analyst pesticides if we do this methylparathion, is that you said it is on the Oregon list right now?
Yes.
We run it then. I'm confirming, but we run every analyte on the Oregon list right now by the triple quad.
Yeah.
So I'm curious to see.
That's what I was saying. I've never heard this.
I've never heard that before off of that's why I was what. So
That it would require a column swap.
right, because right now our method we're calibrating and reporting for it, and we pass proficiency samples I'm need to see if that may not be in our proficient sample that we get, but, or compound, but, I don't know for certain right at this time, but, I mean, we've been going off the Oregon list and haven't had much issue with it and reporting it, based on the triple quad, or, I showed you our problem children, but we still are able to report.
So we can have that as a caveat, the methylparathion, that the Oregon list with a review of the methylparathion, see if it can be run with one column and.
I'm pretty certain we are. I'm finding out right now.
And I would be supportive of that motion, especially adding in Matthew's suggestion that we, at a certain date, certain in the future, we reconvene to take a look at the list and the action levels again.
And Tabitha, it may be a probe issue, not a column swap.
I'm not. Okay.
So I guess I will go ahead and make a motion that we implement the Oregon list with the caveat that we take a look at whether methyl, whatever it is, requires a column swap or not, and that we reconvene in a year to review the list and the action levels.
Should we also include the phased implementation?
I would be open to that.
Also includes a phased implementation as part of that motion.
You're going to run all those compounds.
It doesn't
anyway,
matter if
the
we're getting the same
phases,
standard.
so-
Yeah.
Part of the phase was also adding some, and that's possible too. She's talking about additional pesticides that are starting to come up.
Sure.
I think the
That'd be part of
reevaluation,
our reevaluation.
that calls in, yeah, exactly.
Those are in addition to Oregon, so I think that's something you can look at, but I think it'd be good for the council to get the basic Oregon list, and then we'll talk about whether we want to do split levels on samples and also add a few that are coming online.
That's fair.
So then I
but-
keep my motion as is.
Can I make one recommendation that
Yes.
you split the motion, one related to the pesticides and the other related to the council reconvening, so there's two motions
Sure.
on the table?
That's fine.
And just to add to that, I was going to say, it might make sense if we're going to be splitting them, that we do a 6-month interval and then an annual, like a year-long interval, so that we're able to come together. And if there's anything that happens in the meantime, we'll have a chance to address it and hopefully make more recommendations. And I'm assuming we'll probably have other stuff to talk about, considering that a lot's going to be happening in the next 6 months, so.
So I'll go ahead and just make the first motion then that we adopt the Oregon list with the one caveat for the one compound based on, depending on future research. And then I'll let Joe make the second motion for the reconvening.
So the first motion is to adopt the Oregon list with limits for the pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, growth regulators, with the exception of methylparathion, which we will table till the next meeting.
Seconded.
Is that this list? This blue one you have right here? So we're talking about that one?
Yes.
So we have a motion and a second.
Third?
All in favor? All opposed? Okay.
Okay, and then I would like to make a motion that the council reconvene in 6 months and also in 12 months to readdress some of these issues and just everything.
Third?
All in favor? All opposed? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, very much. That was great. All right. I would just like to congratulate the council on getting through potency, microbial contamination, solvents, heavy metals, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, growth regulators in the last several weeks. We have some additional testing considerations to talk about, and we'll be coming back to the methylparathion. But these are some things that we talked about the last meeting that we decided we'd revisit. So first was on aflatoxins, and then we had some additional. I'm sorry. Yes. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. I was ahead of myself in the congratulations. Methods for pesticide testing.
I'll make a motion to adopt as written.
Second.
All in favor? All opposed? Thank you. We did need to record that vote. Okay. Moving on to aflatoxin. Steve?
This is actually information that was sent by Jay. Some of the different sources for, he had a concern that we should be testing for aflatoxin. I don't know if he wants to,
I'm basically just trying to find some articles and some papers that would be have some backing to it that kind of talk about the aflatoxins. You know, the aflatoxins is what's left over from the mycotoxin. It's, you know, the feces and whatever stuff that's more dangerous to the humans than the actual bacteria itself. And so these are some old, some of them are pretty old, from 1983 to 1997, talking about how. I'm looking at 1, 2, 3. I'm looking at the fourth one down. The spores from phosphorus fungi readily pass through water pipes, survive in smoke drawn from cannabis cigarettes, as do aflatoxins, and that it was worth mentioning. Starting from the top, you know, dead organisms may trigger allergies and asthma. Toxins from microbial overload, such as shinglotoxins and aflatoxins, may pose a problem. Marijuana appears to not yield large quantities of these mycotoxins, but sufficient levels are present to be potential health hazards, or both, to the users and the forensic analysts who are in daily contact with the plant materials. Not reading them all, you know, it may not be a huge, glaring, scary thing, but these are people who are, to get the card in the first place, they have to have a debilitating condition. You know, most of them are pain, but a lot of them have some worse things going on. You know, aflatoxins are maybe not a huge glaring threat, but enough for somebody with a debilitating condition or something in an immunocompromised system that they could get sick from. You know, I like the aflatoxins from the beginning, but I think we already passed that. So I think our only option now is as part of a secondary test on Salmonella or E. coli. I don't know how, because I know we already made a motion on Salmonella and E. coli. I don't know if we can change that, but this is the information that you guys were asking about last time, so I'll try to find some relevant subjects.
Can you remind the panel? I thought we covered this when we did Aspergillus.
So,
and we did a
yeah.
two-path route, right?
For Aspergillus, it was for
Okay.
mycotoxins,
Okay.
yeah. So the
This is
motion
different.
that was passed was related to requirements for either testing for Aspergillus, and then if you get a result above 1 colony-forming unit, then the product has to be tested for mycotoxins, or you can just straight test for mycotoxins, was the motion that was passed at a previous meeting. So we had some discussion about aflatoxins. Thank you, Jay, for that background. And then there's this paper too, and this is one that I think Hope had presented previously about for the rationale that she had presented at a prior meeting about not testing for aflatoxins.
And some of the concerns that Jay is bringing up are addressed by these doctors in medical schools and everything. When they go through their analysis on why they recommend not testing for it. And one of the key things that they say here is that there has never been a documented case with cannabis use of aflatoxin as being an issue.
Well, they'd have to admit they were a felon first if they were using cannabis when they went to the hospital.
Well, but we still see, like even now, even before medical marijuana was legal and everything, we were still picking up. When people get sick,
We get those reports.
We get notified of this. So we know every case of salmonella outbreak. We know what products these are happening. We know when these things, because they have to be reported. And these are also doctors here that are, and everything. So again, there is no documented case of this affecting, there is in other products. I mean, milk.
Not in this state, California, there's been several. There are stories that we can pull up.
So I'm not looking at those right here, but these are coming from medical schools and looking at the safety of it. And
So, forgive my ignorance here, but aflatoxin is a type of a mycotoxin, isn't it?
Yeah.
That comes from Aspergillus?
Yes.
Thank you. So if we are already tested for Aspergillus and it comes up above 1 CFU, then we've got to test for mycotoxins. Wouldn't it show up on that?
I'm not sure.
It's an aflatoxin.
Aspergillus, is it DNA? Or is it Petri dish?
Would What'd you say?
Our aspergillus test?
You can do either, yeah.
Is our ruling saying that you can do either one?
We can use
molecular
the-
method.
Yeah, we can use that, but if we do, we have to confirm by the HPLC method.
So DNA would say yes or no. If there was a dead one or a live one, it would be a fail. If it was a CFU, it would only cultivate live ones, and that wouldn't tell us.
It's just gonna tell us how many mycotoxins.
Yeah,
are
so-
present.
But if there is no aspergillus, there's no aflatoxin.
What if they're all dead? Then if you were doing a petri dish and they were all dead, it would come up negative, but there would still be plenty of aflatoxins because they were having a party there the night before.
Come on, Steve.
I'm sorry.
Is this,
There's an argument to everything, right?
Right.
is this
But
something
again,
that,
when you come down to multiple medical schools and people that reviewed the issues, they don't recommend that it's tested for.
Maybe the motion would be a revisit. Maybe
exactly,
that's
certainly
a
this is something
reanalysis.
we could take a look at again in 6 months or a
Kick
year.
the can, yeah, that's what I would
Some
say.
more research in the next year, see if anything comes up.
Sure.
'Cause I think the current recommendations are sufficient, as you just laid out, yeah.
Just skip that one. Sorry, I didn't put this up, but this was the member recommendation that was out there too. Which we looked at last time. Yeah, we don't need to make a motion to continue on in the agenda unless someone wanted to motion to add. The next one was related to other testing, and there were a variety of other testing that was proposed outside of our broad categories. The first being related to terpenes. So you can see that member recommendation here.
So I just want to make a point, the reference to hand it out to every patient. You know, by and large, almost everyone is now using Confident Cannabis as an online mechanism for distributing test results. And the testing labs we work with all provide their data pretty much automatically there. That allows you to download a PDF of the testing certificate with all the data. Our preferred approach going forward would be to provide that through a QR code or some other mechanism on the product itself. So I'd like to suggest we modify that. You could hand it out for patients that want it, but essentially we're going to provide electronically whenever we can. So we want to make sure that we qualify that to be provided to the patient, however, whatever form.
Yeah, and I would want to say that that would be at a patient request too. I mean, if the patient doesn't care and they know that it's passed, then why should we go through the extra step of providing it to them at every purchase? So similar to how we ask if they want educational material, we could do something similar to that. And the patient requests that we make it available in some fashion or another.
And it does document, the point-of-sale systems do document when you
Get a turn down on education material. You could do the same thing with testing data if you really wanted to have those records.
We're going, under reporting, if we get to those and we actually mine, we're doing really well here today.
So yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that's a really good point, and I would love to see some motions around that about reporting, but I understand you bring it up here because it's the language of this recommendation.
Yeah.
Does anyone have any thoughts on
I don't
terpenes?
see terpenes as necessary. It's not really health and safety.
I agree.
I mean, we can definitely keep the analysis for screening purposes only. Terpenes are very
Label
volatile
claims.
compounds, and you can have it tested today, and if it sits on my shelf for 5 days, those terpenes are going to be a lot lower because they're volatile, and as the plant dries out, you're going to lose those terpenes. So even if someone tests it today and then next week it's not going to be confirmed labeled product that you have, you know, or how you store it. So
it's more about a product.
yeah, but even so, like product claim with this, like I said, the very volatile compounds and that taste and odor that you smell, and you know, like in a week later it doesn't smell as good, it's losing its terpenes, its volatile compounds. So I'd say keep it as just, if you want it analyzed, you can do it as screening type purposes and, well, screening tests, and you get data that way.
I agree. Our charge is health and safety of the patient, right? I agree. I think that it would be unnecessary to make any.
Maybe like hard number claims could be verified, but you could call out prominent terps. I mean, if you wanted to say that, then quantified claims could be
top
for-
5 terpenes in it, you could say that.
Yeah.
If you don't have
I
those
wouldn't-
after a week, I mean.
But if you're going to claim 13% of a
Sure.
given terpene, something like that would be something that
You're
would
setting
require
yourself up.
validation. I'm saying something.
Yeah.
If that's marketing, if you want to call out prominent terps,
Right.
that's how you do that. But
When you say marketing, you need to do this.
Oh, sorry.
Marketing.
marketing.
The trick with the terps, and we live in an industry where you've got a lot of folks running at this as fast as they can, is I'm still trying to wrap my head around what full spectrum isolate is. But I see that on products from this state. So, when we talk about these things, we talk about broad spectrum. We talk about getting more than just, THC and CBD. And I know other suppliers, depending upon how they do their dosing, are going to choose a different path, one or the other. But there's going to be confusion. But I agree that the terpene presence, they may very well go toward providing a healthier experience, but it's not clear there's health consideration in terms of safety. So, basically, I think we leave it to the individual manufacturer to provide that data and substantiate it through their COA.
And it's not something required by the statute. So if there's additional testing, which we're talking about here, we believe these things would have to be added to the statute to test for because it's not currently on the list of things.
I want to say currently too, a lot of companies add food grade terpenes back into their concentrates. And so it's evident. It's evident. So just putting that out there.
But this council can't make
It's not a natural product, it's a food grade.
make recommendations for the future.
So is everyone okay moving on past terpenes? Okay. The next that was recommended for discussion was related to water activity.
Okay, this is Murray again, and I have something to say about this. My technical team got with me about this after the last meeting, and there's a class of products that we make in edibles that might be dairy-related or otherwise have higher moisture content, and they would fail 0.65 AW. They're going to be up in the 0.8 range or something like that. We've actually done tests on our concentrate, and in some cases have found shatter, for example, they can have a water activity of just under 0.65. In other words, pretty close to failing. Of course, you do need to be concerned about that because being the hydrophobic nature of cannabinoids, that water is going to isolate itself and is going to be more likely to develop, pathogens. So if we're going to go with a 0.65, we need to have some kind of caveat or variance for classes of edible products that by definition are going to come in higher than 0.65. We make several aqueous beverage products, including coffee and juice, and those are going to come in way higher. So we need to qualify and take care of that situation.
Yeah, my staff is telling me that they think water activity, the science isn't for cannabis isn't there yet, and there's all sorts of implications not only with the types of products but with the type and time that products are stored and how they're stored and the time lapse between when a test might happen as opposed to when we might get the products available for sale. So no. But yeah, that's so. My staff is telling me that the science isn't there yet to utilize this for cannabis.
Science, just not the stability-wise studies to show how long your product is stable. Because we can test anything for the water activity. As far as the shelf life and stability, as far as what's going to be labeled as how long you can keep it, how you need to store it, how you need to preserve it, that's not there.
I think, Oregon, once again, back to Oregon, they use water activity for flour only, I think, and that may be a good option for us here because loosely bound water, tightly bound water is a good indicator in flour and a relatively inexpensive test.
And would keep the aspergillus down.
And would keep the aspergillus down.
And again, this isn't part of the statute, but so if the council wants to make a recommendation to have this added in the future, the department thinks this would not be opposed to this.
I think after a year seeing what the microbial is going to look like for everybody,
For this,
passing or failing, knowing to evaluate water activity is a good indicator for them.
for us, this is good practice. It's like refrigeration or packaging or different things like that. This is a quality thing that is helping to maintain quality of a product. It's not it's a good thing if you have high water and the product goes bad, it does not mean it's unsafe. But it tends to be something that with products that make it more safe, such as packaging, refrigeration, low water, all of those things in combination the food industry uses for safety.
So, Steve, are you saying that DHS is of the opinion that we don't have the authority to adopt this at this point, and this is something we should revisit?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead.
Just going toward your comment, Steve, about how you treat the product. So, you know, if you did do a water activity test and we did come in and fail it for say, an edible product, which we would argue that can be higher than 0.65, we would be telling you about the mitigation, the HACCP type efforts we've made, for example, by taking, say, a brownie that might come in high and blast freezing it. And so by taking the approach of freezing it very quickly, we can reduce the amount of potential problems in terms of spoilage or, you know, pathogens or whatnot. So that's speaking toward what is your process to mitigate these things.
I think that's exactly right from a food safety standpoint. That's what your is time and temperature control as a safety measure.
So perhaps this is something that we should put on the list for our 6-month or 1-year review.
And I was going to say also, I'm hearing that there's going to be potentially a cleanup bill at the legislature this coming session addressing some of these things. So it might be something that, you know, the stakeholders would consider putting in that as well. So.
Ill-conformed material was the next item that was introduced as a potential recommendation.
I just want to make sure that that recommendation of less than 5% was accurate. That seems like a lot. I mean, if I have a pound, does that mean I can have 5% of that pound be plastic?
You'll tell us before you do that.
So the one part of this, the microbial contamination, that is mold and everything, which we are taking care of with the mold that matters most with cannabis already with the aspergillus. Again, some of these things we like mammalian extra. I think we'd have to add to the statute because that's not. We don't have human contamination other than E. coli, but this, when you're looking for this in food, you're looking for like bugs, wings, there's a lot of different things that go into filth and foreign material. We have not had a chance to flush this out with my group.
So it would mean they would pay for some baling rope?
To me, it seems like the dispensary or the grow would do their own QA process for this as far as a quality assurance team to go through a portion of all their product and look for these type of contaminants, not the lab looking inside your packaging and looking for hair. I mean, to me, you got the bulk of your product at your facility and you can do, you know, a ton of sampling off your shelf to see if you have this, just a quality assurance type program within your own facilities.
When I worked in the pharmaceutical industry lab, you know, we had a QC lab that did a lot of this kind of stuff because it's process control. You're trying to take care of the product to make sure that when you do the official test for the FDA or whoever, then you're going to pass. So this is probably, they actually do this in canning.
You know those little tags you get in your good jeans, designer jeans that you buy that says inspected by in the code? There you go, in-house quality assurance. No seam was ripped.
So, Steve, can you clarify what the state's recommendation is, what DHS's recommendation is on this, if there's any?
I think
none.
There is. Okay.
Right?
no, this was by a member, something we can look at if the council feels it's something.
I mean, I know, DHS obviously has all sorts of regulations regarding sanitation and the cleanliness of the area where we pack and put products in. So it feels like there's an adequate regulatory mechanism to address this.
I don't think at the lab, just because we're getting the minimal amount of product for testing versus not seeing it in bulk and being able to sample it ourselves or randomly,
Yeah, GMP should take care of that.
Everybody's Q&A processes in their weights and measures, they look for these things anyway. We certainly do. And we report it back to the supplier that we work with if we find it. But it's never anything like for 5%. It's a thousandth of a percent.
I have seen some insects, but it was a long time ago. It was like right when I started, like 5 years ago.
Well, your chocolate bar at the grocery store has that too. Yeah.
I got a bag of chips with a whole bunch of ants in it the other day. I believe it.
Okay, then I'm going to move on, and that actually gets us through all the testing stuff.
Real quick, that pesticide, yes, we do test it without changing out any parts on our instrument. So there's that.
So,
Yeah.
Well, I didn't have them. I will when I go to lab later, but yeah, I'll let you guys know next meeting.
thank you. All right, so we're going to move into the next section of our agenda. Yeah. So these are some additional recommendations that we are looking to get from the council, and we're going to start with sample collection, and I know sampling is a big topic for you all. Hopefully you had a chance to look at the slides. There are multiple slides for sample collection in here. Steve put together some background on it, which I'll let him talk about, and then we have a member recommendation that really is around basing a sampling plan on Colorado's regulations, and so the subsequent slides just outline what those regulations in fact are.
So, again, the way we read the statute right now, the dispensary is the one who's testing final products before they can sell it. So that's how we are looking at sampling, if it's going to be divvied up where at different points in the process. I think we need to put a few little modifications to this statement and we'll be fine. So as far as sample collection, since we're
Steve, could you back up just a second? Just one more, back up one slide. So the reference here made to the statute is that non-profit medical dispensaries shall test marijuana. The simple truth is we would probably, in certain cases, require our suppliers to provide testing. So if I buy flour from Copper State, I'm going to ask them to provide test data. I'm just going to provide that test data on to whomever requests it. I'm not touching that plant. Maybe I repackage it, maybe I don't. But I'm not going to, shouldn't be required to do further testing. The same's true if I buy concentrate from, say, Canamo or somebody like that. So I assume this reference means we will facilitate or see to it that testing has been performed on that product and is available.
As long as you don't change product state, right? So
Right.
if you buy distillate and you put it in a brownie, you test again. But
Right.
if you're moving it as shatter.
Absolutely, correct. Is that true? Is what I'm saying correct? I mean, because I don't think the state wants necessarily the burden of who does the testing, as long as they make sure it's done and that the testing represents the final product that's delivered to the patient and that that information is available.
We'd have to get back with a strict interpretation, but that appears to be the intent of the statute.
Yeah, and I believe the nonprofit medical dispensary is defined as both a dispensary and a grow because we're all one license, right? So I don't know that I agree with you. That's the way it should be, and I believe that's the way that that's stated. I know, but before we hop into this, I'd like to hear the stuff about Colorado. But I also, my staff tells me there's a ANSI AQL standard for sampling, and that the Colorado method is actually over and above and duplicative of that. So if and she worked in the Colorado industry for quite some time. If the council is interested, I'd be happy to have her come present at the next council meeting.
When you consider the need to test final product. As I said before, sampling, especially representative sampling, is critical. For those of you who don't know, that's taking, say, 4 brownies out of a batch or something, putting them all together, mashing them together, and testing that as a neutral sort of common. That's representative sampling, so I don't have to do 4 tests, 1 for each brownie. That can substantially reduce the cost, and I think that's reflected in Colorado's approach.
So, we don't have a lot of sampling experts in the department. So,
We do in like our food safety areas.
Food safety and everything, not micro. So, the testing part, I was able to get everybody together. I would definitely recommend, we put together some of the things that we found out of the different states and all. Because of timing, I would definitely adopt another standard if you could, that's already out there. Reason being is that you might want to look at Colorado. We were told that Colorado is a good one to look at because it may be different than the standard you're talking about, but it's been modified, I'm sure, in Colorado based on the little problems they've had. You tend to add a little bit here or there to try to plug the problems that you see, so that may be some of the reason why it's above and beyond.
Yeah, it's my understanding that the Colorado regs were based on the ANSI AQL standards, but then either doubled or tripled. And part of the rationale was to, I think in Colorado, they're required to maintain a representative sample for a period of time, which we were not required to do. So I think it's basically double what which is required. But I'm not the expert on this, but our quality assurance, quality control director is, and has done this in Colorado for several years before she came over here. So if the council would like to hear from her, she would be happy to come present.
It might be good also to have seeing that we have one more meeting, to actually have something that would be votable.
Yeah, she'd be happy.
So
To come with that.
what I'd like to suggest, Steve, in that regard, is invite this individual in. Maybe go ahead and finish your review of the Colorado sample collection so we understand that, and then do a comparison at the next meeting. I think we can get to this quickly because when you just look at the Colorado tables, and for those of you that are interested, here's the Oregon Medical Marijuana Program Control Study Guidance, which is something else along those lines. And I think there's a chart at the end of it that provides that sampling criteria you've provided previously.
So can we put that on the agenda, Ryan?
Yes,
And then
absolutely.
if possible, can we get some free material by the end of the week to send out to the council to
Absolutely.
review for the weekend?
Yep.
Thank you. Okay, so I will urge the council when we send out the materials to review them, because next meeting is our last scheduled meeting unless you guys want to be meeting on Christmas. So to be prepared to vote, right?
What happens to us after the end of the year? Do we turn into pumpkins?
Yes.
That's it? The council is disbanded, or do we continue, or do we not?
There are no further deliverables required of the council after the end of the year. There is a provision in the statute, I believe, that sunsets the council at some time in like 2027 or something like that.
So the intent would be to call upon us then, say in 6 months or prior, if need be, to meet to discuss whether it's rollout or whatever. So you could call upon us to get together again.
We certainly could.
Okay.
Yes.
And now it seems like we have.
Signed
Yeah,
up.
I was going to say, maybe we should amend that recommendation to saying that it definitely happens no matter what, just so we can all come here and say, yes, all is going well. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, the motion that I have reported is that to reconvene the council in 6 and 12 months to review the pesticide list action levels as well as any other items that the council needs to revisit. Which at this point now looks like water activity and probably anything in a cleanup bill and that's it. Yeah. Okay.
So I would recommend, since we were just putting parts together here, that you can look at those in conjunction with what's going to come, hopefully as a votable one, and we'll look at that at the next meeting and go on maybe to reporting here.
I would just note, before we jump to reporting, that there are some other considerations related to transportation of the sample, documentation of the sample, lab numbers being assigned to the sample, and then the storage pieces of the sample as well. So it's not about the sampling plan so much as it is maintaining kind of that chain of custody and integrity of the sample for testing. Does anyone want to have any discussion on this?
I think all of these things would probably fall under Colorado's standard, and we would just be making a comparison to the proposal or what you've assembled from Colorado versus any variation we might choose to vote on.
Sure, I'll just clarify these ones are all a member recommendation, straight copy from Colorado, and then the following ones with the storage considerations are things that Steve's team put together based on stuff they saw from other states.
Does this mean the lab doesn't have to do any more pickups? That prior slide, did you see that? Must be transferred to the laboratory?
Well, the real question is, will our cost come down?
I didn't have to do pickups.
Hey, I'm harping on this now. The rest of you guys
know.
will be in a year.
I don't
trust
know
me.
if we even can with the amount of samples we'll have to do. It's like all staff and lab. It's so hard right now just to keep up with that with pickups.
You think it's hard now?
That's what I'm saying. Well, I'm
What
just
are you
saying
gonna
I
do
need
with-
all staff in house. Like
What do you do if...
pickups take someone 5 days a week, 40 hours a week to do that.
that sounds like a really great job to me right now.
Not in that traffic all day long.
Well, not in Phoenix.
Not in Phoenix. So, as far as like how the product is sold, keeping it at condition, is that something that's going to be stated on their chain of custody when coming in, like their ice cream, their apple juice, what temperature, and we have to accommodate that and pull it out at that temperature and test at that temperature?
So those are things that are coming from other states. So what they're saying is if it's a frozen product, it needs to be maintained frozen until it gets to the lab, until you actually get to the testing part, so that it isn't degrading. Because if you were to
So in that case, if we got some melted ice cream came in the door on a hot day, we turn it down because the integrity of it is not the same as when the patient, okay.
that's what the other states are saying. And
How is the state looking at using multiple labs to do the same sample study with all the different results that we are getting today from using multiple testing agencies to test the same type of sample?
so we're under reporting, we're going to get into that, and I can talk about whether you can do a repeat sample or comparisons, and there's a whole discussion coming up about what result you might get from one versus another. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I could take a sample of just any random manufactured food, flour, bud. I could chop it in 3 different perfect samples, take all 3 of those samples to 3 different testing facilities here in this state, and get radically different results from all 3 of those.
So here's the answer to that. I've been through all of the labs. There's a great deal of difference between the way things are currently being tested and instrumentation. So I would expect that to be so. So what we're in the process of doing here is building standards that are going to bring probably similar instrumentation, similar methods, and I would expect, just like when I started the environmental program in '92, the results were way different. I would expect, as you can see today with the environmental labs, things are going to be coming a lot closer. It's not going to make as much of a difference as far as quality. If there's a huge disparity in quality, then you might get, there's been articles about lab shopping where you'd want to go to this lab or the other. Hopefully, after we get the standards in place here, quality and testing is not going to be what is going to separate the laboratories. What's going to separate the laboratories will be service. What are you going to do as far as holding time, reporting, how quickly can you get it out, and everything else. We're hoping to build a standard where there's not going to be a difference between the testing.
Keep our fingers crossed.
Yeah. It took a while in the environmental world, but I would say that we're pretty good on the environmental side right now.
Because as a manufacturer, we're a slave to our testing. And when you get bad results, bad information is worse than no information at all.
Right.
And we're in multi-states, we have testing and regulations in other states that really has no standards for the lab, and yet they're requiring testing. And we can take samples to 3 different labs and get 3 different results. I can take a test, a terpene test, or a cannabinoid test, or a microbial test, 3 different labs, and again, each one of those individual tests are radically different.
So that's one of the reasons why we've gone with a plus or minus 20%.
Well, that'll help, certainly to start with, and we keep our standards way tighter than 20%, trust me. But, you know, given that said, it still gives us at least a window to, yeah, and this varies between the labs and the efficacy of the product that's made, right? I mean, you still have huge variables in there we're dealing with.
Especially with topicals, which are really difficult in terms of getting that right.
So hopefully on November 1st, once we have all the labs certified and on the same standard, that this will be less of an issue for you.
So we'll come back to this. Just one more, and I just want to double check that you don't want to talk about this today, but we had some of this brought up related to sampling too, and that was related to the homogeneity of cannabinoids in edibles, and as you're talking about, Murray, with the representative sampling, and that might get to some of that, and then the latency issue is also something that you raised.
Right, and so some of this will go toward remediation. For example, if you fail a test, if it was a result and we said, well, we know darn right this product's right, the lab let us down, the amount of time necessary to request a remediation or retesting needs to be short, as in the amount of time that that testing needs to take place. So our recommendation is 48 to 72 hours for those 2 things. 1, to notify the state we're going to retest, and 2, to actually have the lab do it. Because that's already could be as much as 5-6 days on our calendar, and our shelf life suffers from that.
So in 4 slides, we're going to remediation. And then who allows what, and then the council can go with what they want as far as remediation or retesting and everything.
2, I didn't see anything yet, and about like as far as the packaging when it comes in a custody seal or unopened, a full bottle. And that's another thing that the industry, you know, they only have so much product. They don't want to send us full bottles sealed or a couple packages so we can test homogeneity throughout. A lot of it's just bits and pieces in plastic bags and open tinctures that's already been sampled and the seal broken. And so the integrity of normally in a compliant lab with food, you have to have it sealed, unbroken, like it's exactly how the client would or the patient would get it off the shelf. And we don't get that many cases, and I get why. It's the cost. You don't want to submit full bottles and unsealed packages. And another thing too is
It shouldn't be a factor.
we see it though. It may not be with everybody, but we see it.
How a patient might submit a test, somebody like that.
Everybody puts concentrates and oils in these little scintillation vials and sends it to us, and it's been laying over. It's been leaky in the packaging, so we get what we get and we test as is.
We have no objection. I don't think
not everybody does, but
to be providing, because to us, we want you to see the product.
I'm just saying, as far as the mixed results that you get sometimes, it's really in the integrity of how they brought the sample into us. And it's 100 and something degrees in the summer, and you can see clearly the oil separated in the tincture product or in the juice or whatever, and it's not brought in at the temperature it should be. So a lot of it has to do, or a pastry's been sitting and it's wrapped in a paper towel, and you see all the oils in the towel. That's where your cannabis is in the oil of that pastry or whatever. It draws out as the product dries out. So a lot of the different results too is we don't have apples to apples what we tested compared to what the next lab tested and how it was submitted. Did it really come to us with coolers and and properly packaged to us so we can get a good aliquot of the sample? And a lot of times too, those tinctures, we pull up the syringe and there's isolate or oils all on the top of it, which clearly it's not in solution all the way. And we can only do so much as far as the lab. We don't emulsify again. Sometimes we contact the client and we can add a little bit of heat to do it, but we don't reformulate the products as they come in or make sure they're completely homogenized, the whole bag of chips, if we see oil on the packaging. And you can see it clearly on popcorn, where the oil is all over on the inside of the packaging. And so we know that's where your cannabis is, because it's probably putting the product in some kind of oil form. So as far as like going lab to lab too, we really don't get apples to apple samples, and really not the proper samples even come in. So if we could have some kind of guidelines too, which I'm sure there probably will be at some point, of how the sample is delivered to us. I know you said temperature, you just said integrity of the sample, but that really, the integrity of it, we can write it down how it looks, but there's got to be some kind of standard on as far as us getting the same product at this lab to the next lab, that it's all going to be submitted the same too, and at the proper temperatures that it's supposed to be. That's my tidbit on that. I just hear that so many times, like from lab to lab, it varies, but you should see what comes in and all the oils on all the, especially during the summer. Especially, you see oil all over all the stuff, because no one, they just bring it in, they kept it in the car, they went to lunch, and here's my sample, So.
Quick question. Do most labs have recommended guidelines of samples that are being tested, something along those lines?
I have minimal sample requirements that I need, and I document on the chain of custody, was it room temperature, was it frozen, or cold, or I have a couple things, and then I document if there's anything, if it was leaking, or that way we can note to the client it was leaking, but we got out what we could. I mean,
pictures too, I'm guessing.
We do take pictures, but that's all we can do. We don't turn down the product, but we let them know what it looked like to us. So
currently in the marijuana regulations are the environmental regulations for this. So when we put together our initial packet, it said, see the environmental rules, and we deal with chain of custody, that they need to be documenting how the samples are coming in and everything. So that's currently in the regs right now. And we would be looking at that labs are documenting how samples are coming in. If there's any kind of issues with the sample leaking and different things. So we already have some of that already in the regulations right now. What we're going to talk about would be above and beyond a little bit, specifically for cannabis that aren't in the environmental regs right now for reporting.
I'm curious too, when you say final product in packaging, I'm assuming, let's say a vape cartridge. You know how hard it is to get oil out of those things? I mean, we literally sometimes have to put something over and put a hammer to it. I mean...
If you want to know how to do that, we are the ones that know how to do that.
Okay. I'm just saying, some products are almost impossible to get asthma thing, like we're squirting out, how many...
So we did a study on the vapes and the cartridges, because I think we had an actual patient that was in the hospital in the past because of pesticides in those. So we had to work out methods and procedures for opening those.
But there's multiple different kinds.
I know. So all of the other states, when we had the issue with the vapes, a significant number of them have come to us, and we have given those procedures to them on how to get into those. And we would be happy to share anything that we have on how to do that, because we may have...
Well, sometimes they're easier. You can uncork them at the end and stick a syringe and get them out. But other times we're looking at this thing like the robot.
Well, I don't know what's the problem. Our competitors' cartridges always.
I would just say in general, from like a technical assistant standpoint, if there's weird kinds of things that need sampling, our lab does get all kinds of bizarre things to test for suspicious substances or whatever all of the time. And has to extract it from a variety of different matrices and things. So that's not a part of recommendations from the council, but just in general with labs, that's something that we can provide some TA with some team and inspections.
How much of this is really really on the testing labs to set requirements for the samples that are provided to them? In other words, if I said, well, here's a frozen juice and try to give it to DVT, and they're going to say it's not frozen. I mean, can't they set those standards, say we will only accept products in, final retail packaging, you have to provide this, I mean, can they state those standards and place those requirements on us, especially since they're not picking up?
I'd prefer not to. I'd rather Steve set them and say, you have to take as the, you know, if the juice is supposed to be at fridge temp, if the ice cream is supposed to be frozen a certain degree, that it needs to be upon arrival. And we would check the temperature when we get there, when it got there. I don't want to set those standards as far as accepting or not accepting.
In general, our rule would have some information in it about.
So are you looking for input into this?
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll get you some.
If you have recommendations about temperature storage,
We can.
sealed
We can
packaging.
come back and talk to you about all of that, yes.
Back to
We'll do that by Friday.
the homogeneity thing. There's only, my bottom line with this is making sure it's homogenized. I think that should be on the sampling side as far as what they're supposed to do on their end. There's only so much we can do so we don't affect the integrity of the product in lab. Like as far as adding heat, there's only so much we can do to keep it in dissolution too. So our basic technique for homogenation should be okay and sufficient for most products, and that their how they submit the product should be on the other end. Do you know what I mean? It's really hard to make sure all products are homogenized when they come, like for us to do it. We try.
Is there any way to find homogeny of the cannabis? You know, because potency is one of our things, so making sure it's homogeneous.
Well, we do flour and stuff. We homogenize that kind of stuff ourselves.
Usually you just take a portion, right?
No, we can, depending on how big it is, we'll extract the entire thing. We'll homogenize the whole thing and then take an aliquot from that. But again, it's oils. They're all over the place. You take a brownie, you can freeze dry. There's all sorts of techniques that you can do, but still, you're talking about homogeny. What about this side of the pan versus this side of the pan? What if I only got this side of the pan? You know what I mean? That's what I'm saying. It should be on both ends as far as as much as we can do, and how they take their, like things like brownies and things that oil disperses all over and drops down as it's cooling, you know, things like that. It should be on both ends as far as ensuring homogeneity.
So when I worked at the Ag Lab, we had to do splitting all the time to get so that it was the same. And there's a number of different techniques. I would bet, I haven't looked at this lately, but it seems like the AOAC had a number of different ways of sampling and things you should be doing to split depending on the product. I would bet there's information out there on that because we were using it. And we used to take our stuff to court and have to prove that it was consistent and homogenized. And the results that we were getting were good. So I would bet that's there. I haven't had the chance to go back and do the AOAC.
Maybe we're still holding off on the sampling specifics, but maybe we can agree on making sure it's homogeneous, making sure that whatever sample is submitted, that all the labs are using the entire sample to find out its homogeneity. Instead, because I know some labs do a little portion and then make quantitative, find out what the full total is. So maybe we can agree on making sure the labs test the entire sample.
Yeah, but if you make a batch of popcorn like this and you send us this much, I can extract this much and take an aliquot, but what about all that popcorn with all that oil and butter everywhere?
That's what I was tabling for later. We could decide to say 5 samples from that batch of popcorn. But right now we could decide that when you get that batch of popcorn, whether it's 5 little samples or 1, that you test, you emulsify the whole thing, you run fluid through whatever, you test that whole thing that they sent you, so you can make sure to say that it was 100%.
It's got to be finished goods.
That's one approach. There are multiple approaches to do this, right? So I think we should certainly hear about the alternative approaches to doing the sampling before we make a decision. I mean, in principle, I agree with you. Yeah, we should establish that you should test for homogeneity, you should report those results, you should achieve a certain consistency, whatever that number is. The actual approach, the model you use, whether you ask me for 4 brownies from the batch and she's going to do it all, or whether I give her 1 brownie and she takes 4 sections and then makes, for a sample or what. I mean, I don't know what the best choices are. I'm really focused on cost.
It's the more we have to do on Ender, it's going to be cost. It takes a lot of time for one medible.
So just like in the environmental world, the sample is where most air is. It's not the laboratory. So.
Thank you for saying that. Thank you. Did everybody hear that?
It's absolutely true. If we don't come up with a way of having a consistent sample, then we're just, it can be anything, and you're going to have fights between labs, you're going to have all kinds of crises here. So hopefully Ryan can bring the Colorado plan, which has been, everybody keeps pointing us to, is they've done a good job of trying to work this out. not to say that we're not going to have that as an issue, but hopefully you can adopt something that somebody's already tweaked to be in the best shape we can when we start this.
Okay, so we'll look forward to that for the next meeting and some read-ahead materials so we can be prepared to make some decisions on that. Let's talk about reporting results. Steve has just a couple of points to make, and then let's talk about that method of always handing it out versus paper versus electronic and all that. Steve?
So we envision that there's going to be two reports here. That there's going to be one that will be a technical report, which will have the actual results of each pesticide and everything on it, and then one that's available to the patient here. And this is just considerations. The reason being, and we can maybe go to the next one, I actually have an example of this. I found this in Nevada. Actually has, this would be a patient report. So you can see in the safety section, when it's talking about pesticides, it says pass.
It's talking about the top right.
Up on the right there. And then when you're getting into the cannabinoids, it's actually listing them. It has a picture of the product. So when the patient asks for the certificate analysis, they'll see a picture that'll match what they just bought. It'll say this product has passed the safety. The problem that we see even in the environmental world is people don't understand that there are pesticides, there are solvents, these are in the product, but they're in a safe level. They look at it and say, so you're saying 0.45 is safe with this, but 0.5 isn't safe, so how is it, so it gets really hard to explain that what a safety level is and everything. So with Nevada and with this laboratory and all, you can ask for the technical report if you want, which will have the actual values of what each pesticide is that they're finding. Because it's likely that when Tabitha's lab does a test, they're going to see pesticides. We have instruments up there that test in parts per trillion and see pesticides and all kinds of things, but not necessarily at levels that are unsafe. So that's why we propose that, similar to Nevada, they have a patient certificate of analysis report that the patient would get and look at and have confidence of seeing that it is safe, it has passed the limits. And then another report that is coming to growers, dispensaries, and everybody that says, hey, we do have some pesticides in here at this level. It may not be above the safety level, but yet we know we might want to start to tweak the system. And for us, we actually, when we're reviewing lab data, we will see the actual results that are coming up. So when we do our inspections, we would be pulling up technical reports, looking at the analysis to make sure that those levels that they're bringing onto those reports are actual numbers. So that's something, our recommendation.
Why would you need two? I mean, because if everything has to be tested, why would the patient need to see? It's not on the shelf, it hasn't been tested and didn't meet the state's criteria. So why two?
So which one would you want?
Well, that's not ISO certified. I could tell you that right now. It's Confident Cannabis, and that's not going to pass the criteria for a certificate of analysis for ISO. I just went through that. So we use Confident Cannabis too because some of our clients we give them the option, but we have our own element now that does the technical report that has all the information on there. We probably could add the pass or fail to that, but there's no sense in having two. The patient doesn't need to see that anymore because it's on the shelf because it passed all the state criteria. It's just extra work, and that's not ISO certified.
So when you're looking at this as one report, when we look at a technical report, it could be 20 to 30 pages.
They can,
Because it has all
the compounds and it
all the
has,
different
right.
pesticides and what
Right, but that can be
levels are-
delivered in electronic format pretty easily. That's
On
how,
request.
that's how we do it
Right.
now.
And if that's what you want to give your patients.
But
fine.
that's,
It was just a consideration that I saw this online
I'm just saying, why do you have to give them to the patients now?
because
Would,
it's in
would
the
you guys still
statute.
hand them out if if they're on the shelf, they pass? Why would you waste that paperwork in
statute.
providing that?
The statute says that if the patient wants
On
the
request.
Oh, request. You can give them the technical. Not many would ask, I'd assume. It's a lot more work to do it two ways, to have two different reports for your report, for your LIMS system to report. And I know just that one alone wouldn't suffice for ISO certification because they want certificate of analysis at the top too.
That's perfectly fine with us. If
If
the
you're-
council wants to go with just one report, we're.
I make a motion to go with just one report.
Hang on.
I appreciate the technical report and need for it, and I don't even have a trouble if the state asked us to generate those for the state's benefit. But, I want to be able to point my patients at a label on their product, have them point their phone at it, and there's the data. We've just got to keep it simple. It's hard enough for them to interpret this thing, much less, try to get it.
That's what this is. This is to help the layman interpret what exactly it is.
That's not the technical.
And that's exactly what I was going to address from the patient's perspective. It would be great to have all the reports available. We obviously don't want to make it burdensome on anybody, but this versus the technical report, I'm assuming this is easier to read. Do we have a technical report we could view really quick?
Because they
Okay.
tend to be 20 to 30
Okay. So,
pages of-
I would maybe, does the front page of the technical report have like a summary like this or anything?
the technical
Oh,
report-
but this is confident cannabis though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Right.
So it's a summary of the technical, is that
Yeah,
correct?
yeah,
Okay, I follow.
Pass, you're done.
But they don't really
See what the level was. If it was less than the reporting limit at some level, you don't see what those numbers were. If it was right at that reporting level, you don't see that. You just see pass or fail.
I don't think the statute says anything about requiring two reports or anything that's ISO certified in
To
terms of
be
the
ISO
report.
certified, your certificate of analysis has to have all the certain criteria on it. So we had to add every single analyst that did that test, the date and time they analyzed that test. There is a lot of criteria. They have to have the contact person for whoever sent in the sample. It has to have a lot more information than what's on that.
which is the technical report.
Right.
So it was just a suggestion by the department that it may be easier to have this for the patients and then the one that is required in our environmental field and probably by ISO, like you're saying, because it has all the quality assurance that is run. It has
Right.
all of the information is on a final report. And
Something
that-
like this builds confidence with the patients too. When they see
Agreed.
a report they can't understand, when they ask you for some information, it's just overwhelming. Something simple,
Exactly.
to the point, hey buddy, here you go. Oh, that's amazing, let's go.
I would say the technical report should be the only thing required, and then if we can generate this off of that, if we can get that up and going in our LIMS or reporting systems, then great, we can hand that out, but it's
I
going to
think-
be hard to do both when,
From a growing perspective too, I mean, it's nice to be able to run tests that aren't necessarily required, then you can bifurcate the results. So if you spend $200 on a test and then you're married to that one report, is there a way that you could bifurcate it? I mean, if you're doing a test above and beyond, then you're still married to that test.
it's a lot, well, any LIMS reporting system that you purchase, Confident Cannabis is a LIMS reporting system that they offer for free to labs to use, to utilize to upload your results so they can get these nice, pretty results when you don't have your own LIMS system in-house. We didn't. We used it for, we had our own, but then we used them for a bit. Now we bought Element, which is a way bigger reporting system, so it has its own as well. So we're trying to not use Confident Cannabis as much because it doesn't provide all the technical information on the report that they want. But I see how this is nice and pretty and easy to use, but it's really hard to generate. We'd have to purchase Crystal Reports. I don't know if you know what that is. Have someone make out of Crystal Reports another reporting tool and generate the reports 2 different times and send out. It's just a lot more work. I'd say if it's easy for some labs to do that within their own reporting system, then sure, but I just don't want it to be a requirement. As of right now, we have so much more on our plate to worry about. Let us get you the technical results up front, and then if we can do this, sure. It's just we're working on our limbs left and right every day to make sure it passes all the ISO criteria right now.
The technical report would be the one that we would definitely want.
Right.
I agree from the patient's perspective. I think maybe to be addressed later, some sort of summary top lines thing that's maybe a little bit more readable. But obviously, each dispensary will have someone who might walk their patients through and that sort of thing if they choose to do a deep dive.
Okay, so let me be clear about this. This is not the technical report.
No.
Right.
All right, so you're arguing that the thing that should be provided to the patient is the technical report, or not?
What we were arguing is that we thought this would be good to give to the patient because they're not going to understand the technical report.
Right, and they won't. So, and as I said, this can be difficult to understand as well if you don't have a clue. But we're not talking about giving something different than this to the patient at request.
We would definitely require, there's no program that isn't going to have a technical report.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this would be just a service thing that the lab might be able to provide beyond what's required by the state that would help in the dispensary. So, but the technical report is the report that we would need as for regulation.
Yep.
It'd probably be like 4, 5, 6 pages max per sample. It's all the compounds for each test. It's small, just like that. It's just down the line and a QA report.
True with pesticides as well. You'd think that would go on for a while.
Yeah. There's 60. They'll fit on a page. And they're not really big.
You could fall back to the dispensary too. Just as a reference, Confident Cannabis, you can create a little placard card with all those details right here in the summary. They can print them out, or you can print them out. And then I've seen some dispensaries just put it down for the product. It tells them all this information. It's plain and simple. Seems like the lab, it doesn't need to be included there. I mean, every sample that I get an 8-page, 10-page report. That's in there, and I've got all the other things that have it there talking about. So I've never not known this not to be in there. But it can be, maybe we can put on the dispensary. They can accumulate the information, make it a little bit smaller, more palatable, and provide it if the client requests it.
So for me and the state, one report, technical report, and that's all I worry about. So, okay. Should we?
Yeah, okay, so I just want to level set a little bit with where we're at right now since we have 5 minutes left in this meeting. We have not yet discussed remediation, retesting, or disposal. You've got a couple of slides on there. There were some additional items as necessary that were brought forward. You'll have the slides on those also for the things that were brought up to the council. Our last meeting is next week. And I have, like I mentioned, the draft report in place also. So my thought would be that we would send you by the end of this week the draft of that report. That will certainly be blanks in there because there's a lot we haven't decided yet. We'll get information from Ryan and maybe Murray that we can send out about sampling to consider. And then I would ask that y'all review what's in here currently for remediation, retesting, and disposal. And if you don't like it, come prepared with a different motion to talk about. Please.
Real quick, just an update, just for DVT, but I'm sure other labs are having the same issue. We went through ISO, we're fine. We're going to have that soon. But the other obstacle right now is the occupancy license. Per the 2016 rule, it says to be able to have a cannabis business, meaning a dispensary, a cultivation, a kitchen, or a concentrate company, you have to be under the license of a dispensary, which we know. And so in order to apply for the occupancy license for a cannabis laboratory, the legitimate way, cannabis laboratory, so they know for zoning purposes, is A, you have to be zoned, you have the same rules apply to dispensaries or laboratories as it does a dispensary where we can be located. Second is that the rule says we have to be affiliated with a dispensary to be able to have a location. We have to be, and it doesn't say laboratory is not included. Only a grow, a cultivation, concentrate, and a kitchen can be the only 3 under dispensary to get an occupancy license for a cannabis business within one of the zoning places that you can be.
The city of Phoenix.
At City of Phoenix.
City of
oh.
Phoenix, we checked Scottsdale, same thing. They said you can apply for a lab unless they missed something. We called and asked. Cannabis, yes, it has the same rules apply. Tempe, Mesa, Casa Grande said they'll get back to me. Glendale, we checked all of them so far. So that's the dilemma that we're up against right now, is to be able to get that occupancy license. And then the state says, for the application, we can't be associated with a dispensary. So at this point, no license as far as saying we are a legitimate cannabis laboratory, because we're not recognized right now.
Thank you. Sorry, I thought you were going to make a comment in mind. So it's not an agenda item?
It's not,
But I wanted everybody,
It just went away, so. it's
Yeah,
not a
yeah,
problem.
no.
I just wanted everybody to be aware. That is a huge dilemma that we just found out. It took like a month to be able to get some input back from them as far as if we'll get our occupancy license, and this is what they told us.
No, I think that's a big deal. I would recommend you follow up with the program after the meeting to talk about what potential next steps are.
Pointed at you, Megan.
Thanks. Yeah. We are aware of this issue also, and I think that was related to maybe one of the additional items that someone brought up that's in a later slide about potential delay of implementation of the statute as a recommendation. We will see you all next week. Thank you so much for your participation in this meeting. Can I get,
Motion.
sorry, I need to pass this sign-in sheet around to you because I don't think we've got all your names recorded on it. What?
George, you gonna make a motion? I was gonna.
To adjourn?
No.
Oh. Go ahead, Ryan. Wait, were you moving to adjourn?
Yeah, if we're not there yet, though.
Does, they're reminding me about voting on the reporting, since it seems like we came to a discussion
Just
to
technical
require a
report.
technical report.
For regulation.
And I'll try to get a pretty one with it. I'll try.
To be revisited in June and December.
So
What's the mode? Is there?
I'll make a motion that we require the labs to only do the technical report, and that we revisit this issue in 6 months at the next meeting, when we have that meeting and discuss potentially doing a summary.
All in favor? All
Aye.
opposed? Motion passes. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Any opposition to that? Okay, meeting's adjourned. Thanks.